Exciting times. So, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I'm here with Konstantin Kisin. Man, thanks very much for joining me.
No, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, since we booked the interview, you've kind of taken off a little bit. I feel like a lot more people are aware of you and the podcast and stuff. I think it's probably because of the Sam Harris interview, really. So yeah, maybe let's start there. Like when he was saying the crazy things, mainly about his sort of being fine with any sort of corruption and just having no interest in examining Hunter Biden's laptop and the story. What was going through your head when he was saying these things? Like,
it's hard to, because as an interviewer, your job is just to let the person say their piece. So in that moment, I was thinking, well, this is a strange thing for him to be saying, and I need to probe and find out what he actually thinks. And I kind of think we did that.
Yeah. Were you sitting there thinking, oh, this is viral content?
Not at all. No, I had no idea that it would go viral.
Right.
I just thought it was... I just thought it would annoy people, you can't. I certainly don't have the ability to predict whether something would go viral or not. We've had plenty of other people in Triggernometry who've said other things that I've thought, well, maybe this will go viral or this will go viral. I think timing is a big part of it, and you can't really predict that.
Yeah, I guess it's like catching the wave of the internet, like a surfer almost sometimes trying to drop the content at the right time.
Yeah. But also, I'll be honest with you, obviously, doing a show, you want people to watch and listen to it. But I never sit there thinking what's going to go viral or how can we get loads of clicks for stuff. It's a kind of fortunate thing with the position that we're in. I feel pretty stable. And of course, you want to grow and you want to expand and you want to get even in more interesting guests for people and whatever. But I never feel like I'm here to create viral content. In the moment, I try to just be present to what's happening, be in the conversation, ask questions that come up for me. Francis will ask questions that come up for him, and you just kind of trust that's the process, and then whatever happens after that is what happens after that.
I was interested to hear when you were on Joe Rogan with Francis recently that your podcast had kind of started out of you voting Remain and then being interested to try and understand like the Brexit vote and what a lot of people had been thinking, like why suddenly were so many of our fellow countrymen and women or people, why were they so like vehemently in favor of leaving the EU and sort of like, sticking this middle finger up to like the liberal elite? Like, was prior to that like investigation of it, did you understand what people meant when they talked about this like liberal elite?
Not particularly. I would say I was probably less political at the time anyway. I was always interested in politics, but I didn't follow it that closely. And I suppose the truth is that had it not been for doing trigonometry, I would unquestionably be considered by people to be part of the liberal elite. If you look at the industry that I come from, the comedy industry, you're going, well, these are exactly the sort of people that tend to be part of that world, and I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to open my mind beyond that, because otherwise it's, a friend of mine invited me for dinner the other day, and we were at Soho House. And I just look around and I go, I don't like any of these people. You know what I mean? So I feel like I've kind of been somewhat liberated by the process to be able to make my own mind up about things, to choose the people that I want to hang out with. And there's, in addition to that, in London and in a few other places, there is a kind of counterculture that's forming as well, which I'm really pleased to be involved in, whether it's Comedy Unleashed, which is a comedy club here in London, Triggernometry. There's other things that are currently being worked on that will also be part of that same space. Claire Fox, who founded the Battle of Ideas, where I've spoken since we started Triggernometry every year. It's an opportunity for people to hear a different set of takes on many of these issues. So I am grateful to have been to have had my eyes opened somewhat.
Like, do you think that period, that sort of eyes opening, has continued through COVID and the pandemic in the last 2.5 years? Like, I feel like perhaps we've been on quite kind of a similar journey in this, in that you can read, like, if you read, well, maybe I'd recommend my first book, but it's written from quite a left-wing point of view, in like just very anti-Tory. I was very critical of the Brexit campaign, mainly because of their use of quite predatory data harvesting techniques, and those were the things that concern me. But it's quite clearly quite left-wing, and I was very sort of anti-Tory, anti-conservative in America. And since then, I've been on like a slow period, or a slow journey, where it's like suddenly I've realized, like, hang on, these people on the right have, like, okay, I still like disagree like fundamentally with a lot of the things they would, but a lot of the time I'm like, okay, no, wait, maybe there's a point here. Like they have a point. There's like there's something real behind it. And it's been a really weird journey for me, because I've finally arrived at this position where my best friend was basically the entire time. And he's like, Josh, it took you 5 years in writing a book to suddenly see I was right. So, like, do you feel like
So you've made your friend happy at least?
Yeah, well, to an extent. Now he's off on some new crazy pursuit that I have to follow.
Right. Yeah, well, it's interesting because I don't think I was ever massively anti-Tory, but I wasn't pro-Tory. I'd voted Labour and Lib Dem. I voted Lib Dem because actually at the time that I voted for them, they actually stood up for the things that I still believe and believed back then, which is freedom of the individual, freedom of expression, blah, 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 blah. And then when the Lib Dems were no longer in any way a viable party, I started voting for Labour because I was, probably centre-left and or centre, and the Tories didn't seem to me like, I wasn't going to vote for David Cameron, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I think, and I am still not pro-Tory. If we talk about the pandemic, if I look back at the last 12 years, I look back at the last 2 years, the Conservative Party has done a lot of things that I massively disagree with, including, by the way, on this cultural progressivism stuff that they are simply implementing or allowing to be implemented in every major institution in this country. So I really think that if you are looking at it from a party political or a left versus right point of view, you're going to miss a lot of the nuance of what's happening. So I think both parties are, well, they're useless in different ways. We've got a new prime minister now. I always try, whatever party they're from, to give them a bit of a few months bedding in time where I don't jump down the throat for anything they say that they did. And actually, maybe I've got brain damage, but I feel like Liz Truss has said the right things in her first few days in office. And it remains to be seen whether there's going to be follow-up on that. But what is quite clear to me is that she is a person of principle to some extent. It's funny because she's obviously changed her mind on a lot of things, but I do think it's clear that she has certain principles that she would stick to even if she's under attack for them, which is a break from pretty much everyone we've had in power for the last God knows how many years. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. I really don't think of myself as a party political person. I get invited to various party conferences and stuff like that, and I always turn it down. I don't want to be a party political person. I don't want to be involved in any party. I try to maintain my own mind and my own neutrality about these things. So I suppose the only way to do it would be to go to all the party conferences, but I have a life.
Yeah. I mean, it's not that I've suddenly become pro-Tory. It's just I've suddenly realized that the left parties are screwing us just as hard as the right, and that we've got this really disturbing fusion of both ideology and money being funneled into both parties from the same kinds of people, and that backs up as well. They push the ESG or culture war stuff that sort of you mentioned there. But I'd love to know, actually, do you get concerned that comedians have become the most reasonable and smartest people to comment on almost anything these days? It's the more I think about it, the more I'm like, don't people warn about this kind of period of time in a country when Joe Rogan has probably it has the most popular show in the world. Russell Brand has got like 5.6 million subscribers on YouTube. Every time I look, it goes up. Your podcast is becoming bigger and bigger, especially here in the UK. And, you know, there's a whole host of other people where the comedians are the adults in the room. Like, does that worry you for like the state of a country if that's the case?
Yeah, I think so. Although I disagree with your premise. I don't know that we're becoming the adults in the room. We're just, I think all of us, Joe, certainly Joe and us, out of the people that you mentioned, we are trying to just have interesting conversations from an honest place.
But you're the only, like, there's no like mainstream journalists who are doing that.
Yeah.
Like, that is horrifying.
Yeah. Well, the mainstream media have been busily destroying themselves for a very long time. Much, by the way, like the comedy industry. It's not really comedians that are doing this. It's like a few people who happen to be comedians is my interpretation of it. I don't think it's being a comedian that makes it more likely. I think it's more that comedians are naturally people who are quite happy to be center stage. They're quite happy to be in front of a camera. They have to be able to speak. They have to be able to be liked by people, I suppose, as part of it as well. They have to, there has to be a certain lightness to it. So that's kind of, I think, one of the big shifts that's happened as well is most people don't really want it. They'll happily spend 3 hours listening to something, but I'm not sure they always want it to be, you know, the BBC style of interview. They want there to be a bit of raw to it. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's mostly that. And yeah, the mainstream media, I think it's a different issue to the one that you're posing here. But yeah, I agree. The mainstream media has been busily destroying themselves for a long time. And long may it continue.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a boon for anyone attempting to make alternative stuff because the worse they get, the more people turn and look at it. I mean, speaking of which, do you think anyone is still watching the royal coverage at the minute? The wall-to-wall BBC? Like,
I haven't been paying attention to it myself, but I bet you there's a lot of people that are watching it.
Still?
Oh,
it's
100%.
Been days.
Yeah, I know. I think people will laugh and sneer and whatever, and it's certainly I wouldn't spend days watching the royal stuff around the royal wedding. But I do think, particularly in the world, the way that it's going and the way that it feels to a lot of people now, which I don't think many people now feel that the world is necessarily going to keep getting better all the time, right? I think a lot of people feel that the economy and all sorts of cultural trends are not trending up. They're trending neutrally, if not down to some extent. And in that context, in that environment, you know, we've got a war in Europe for the first time in you know, whatever it is, 80 years. The economy is, again, after 2008, going down, and many other things. The death of the Queen after 70 years is one sort of continual factor. I think that's why it's been such a big thing, because it's, I think to a lot of people, it kind of feels like the end of an era. And I'm not surprised by people watching that for a long time. I think, but by the way, there's another thing to it as well, which is I think most of what you see, and most of what we all see now, we don't live in the real world. Most of us live on the internet, right? Most of what you see is being created or made or recorded in a few metropolitan areas, which are populated by very specific types of people who make very specific types of content, who have very specific types of opinions. The rest of the country, I think, is quite different and feels quite differently about the traditional institutions of this country, the traditional ways of being in this country, and so on. So I think you're seeing that outpouring, which is, I think, just people like me and you who live and work and create and whatever in London, we kind of have our own slant on it. I'm not surprised by the outpouring at all.
I mean, I'm surprised mostly by the queue. I can't believe people will wait that long. I mean, I can. Part of me can, but part of me is looking at it being like I looked this morning and it was 5 miles long with an estimated wait time of 14 hours. Like, what? And people are still joining the freaking queue.
Yeah, well, there's got to be a part of that, which is like, oh wow, there's that many people doing it. Okay, it's 14 hours. Well, that's like a cool thing to do. That's like a cool thing I can tell my grandchildren. I queued for 17 hours or whatever it is. I suspect there's a part of that. Like once it gets past a certain point, the length of the queue is no longer a deterrent for a lot of people. It actually attracts them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But no, I've got, as I said before, I've got a life, so I wouldn't do that. But at the same time, like I said, I think it was a really important moment, and I think a lot of people rightly feel that the Queen was somebody who's worthy of honouring in the way that she's being honoured, because this is someone who served this country in a way that I don't think anyone from our generation is gonna be able to do, really.
No.
We're just different breeds of people now, and she did that for 70 years with a tremendous amount of dignity and self-restraint. You know, this is the thing.
She didn't comment in public. That's one nice thing about her.
Right, and that's actually quite hard to do nowadays, I think. So yeah, I get why people feel as strongly as they do.
See, like I was talking to Sonia Polton about this on her morning show today,
Right.
And she asked me what my feelings are on the monarchy. I was like, well, you know, I think there's a lot to be said for not having an elected, politicized head of state. There's something to be said for that. I think it's useful in terms of having one thing that represents the country that you don't vote for, and therefore it doesn't become as polarized, especially in the climate we're in right now. That seems quite an attractive thing. But at the same time, I'm like, oh, she paid Andrew's fucking legal payoff to Virginia Giuffre, and they're really good friends with Jimmy Savile, her and Prince Philip, and there's some really disturbing stories about him sneaking around Buckingham Palace with like young girls, and I'm like, oh. It's just like every time I think about the thing that you're talking about, this, how she served the country with dignity and how she, you know, didn't speak out, how she did, like, and you know, there's a lot of things to admire about the job that she did. At the same time, like in the back of my head, there's all these gnawing things. It's just like she's fine with like all of the awful things that those people did, including her. I know it's her son, but still.
Yeah, I don't know that she was fine with it, but I hear you. There's a compromising thing there. Look, I'll be honest with you, the monarchy is not something I care passionately about. It's not something I think a lot about. My perspective on the Queen was, this is someone who served the country for a long time. I don't disagree with you that the way Prince Andrew was treated is not the way he should have been. You know, people who are credibly suspected of crimes of that nature should be properly investigated and go to prison. But I don't put that down to the Queen. And I don't know much about the Jimmy Savile thing. It seems to me quite a lot of people were duped by his behavior.
Yeah.
So if we're going to go down the list, there's quite a lot of people who are going to be discredited.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'd be happy to discredit each and every one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But I'm just saying not everybody necessarily knew or was complicit.
No.
But I don't know that much about it.
No, I have to agree with you there. So in terms of people,
you must agree with me.
Well, yeah. In terms of people that you've had on the show, or people that you've maybe entertained having on the show, who's been the person who, I don't know, you've maybe mentioned to someone before that I've got this interview lined up with this person. Like, who's the person you've got the most pushback on, or from someone saying, oh, you shouldn't speak to him, or you shouldn't speak to her, or don't speak to them?
Well, I never really have those conversations with people, like, before we have someone on. You know, we decide internally who we're going to have on. So I never have the conversation before. So I guess if you're asking who have we got the most shit for having on, it kind of depends, because everybody's got their own thing, haven't they? Like, there are people who are really upset that we had Posey Parker on, who is a gender critical campaigner for women's rights, and she's very critical of elements of transgender ideology. There'll be people who don't like the fact that we had Carl Benjamin on, formerly Sargon of Akkad. There'll be people who are angry we had Sam Harris on, I suppose, too. So yeah, I the thing is, initially when you start out, those questions are really like important, and you think about it a lot. But as you find your feet in doing what you do, actually, the reaction of people that I've never met sort of matters a lot less to me. Do you know what I mean? It's like if I was walking down the street and some person came up to me and was trying to give me feedback on my clothes or whatever, I'd be like, well, I don't really care what you think. And it's the same with a show, because you'll find this as you get bigger and you have a bigger audience, you're no longer, even if you ever were, you're no longer even able to maintain the illusion of pleasing all the people all of the time. So at the end of the day, you kind of have to go back to first principles, and the first principle is you started this because you wanted to have interesting conversations with people that you find interesting, and then clearly there's an audience out there for that, and that's all that matters, really.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, really. I do have quite a lot of fun laughing at the comment section sometimes. Like, especially if someone's really like going at me.
Yeah.
I'll immediately be on the phone to my friend and be like, "Oh, you got to get in the comments."
Oh yeah. I used to totally love that stuff. And the thing that happens over time though is you've got much more interesting things to do. So I tend to have a scroll through the comments every now and again just to entertain myself. And also, the truth is, in addition to what is 99% of comments, which is inane drivel, there is 1% of people who've actually put something thoughtful in and made a comment that is actually worth reading too. And I tend to be more interested in those nowadays. But I know, the process that you're talking about, it's a very natural process for going from basically not being a public person to being a public person. And what happens is you're navigating that shift by suddenly realizing that a lot of people now have an opinion about you. And internally, that's quite difficult to process. Your entire biology is kind of designed to not have you be the person that everyone's looking at. That's why everyone has a fear of public speaking, because historically speaking, in sort of evolutionary times, what does evolution psychologists call it? But ancestral environment, I think, is what they call it. Basically, when you're living in a small tribe of 150 people, if you found yourself in a position where the entire tribe was looking at you in silence, that usually would not end well, unless you were the leader of the tribe, which is one of the reasons people want to be there. You see what I mean? So what you're going through is a process that we all go through, and I'm still going through as well, which is how do you deal with the fact that thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people now have an opinion about you that you don't control, you're not able to correct, even if it's misrepresentative of your position, and blah, 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 blah. And it's, it's exciting and it sucks all at once. You just kind of have to go through it.
Do you get recognized much, like out and about these days?
I get recognized a lot more if I'm with Francis. He has a much more distinctive face. And we together...
Yeah, people like... Yeah.
So he's got the bad end of the stick, unfortunately, on that. He gets recognized all the time. Whereas I get recognized occasionally, which I enjoy. It's not that I don't enjoy people having a chat and saying, "Oh, I love your show," or whatever. But I wouldn't enjoy it if it happened like every time I left the house. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's levels to it, I'm sure.
Yeah, so I am quite keen to remain as anonymous as you can be when your entire life depends on being recognized, so people knowing what you do. But I'm grateful, I guess, is that like the age of the mass celebrity is over. Do you know what I mean? Like those superstar celebrities that used to be the only type of celebrity, really. There's only going to be a small number of them going forward, and it's all going to be, niche. And I'm really pleased about that. I like, that's one thing that meeting a few of the more famous people on our US trip reminded me of, is like, I don't want to be that famous.
Was there like a moment where there was like someone getting, I don't know, swamped by people or something?
It wasn't swamped, but just, I can't say specifically because it's other people's private stuff, but it's like you suddenly become aware that for a lot of those guys, security is a big issue. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like somebody might look outside and go, "There's a car waiting. I don't know what that car is." And then like they send 3 bodyguards out to go and investigate it or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't want to have to deal with that.
Yeah. Yeah, that seems like if you're at the point where you got bodyguards, that's going to get invasive.
On the one hand. On the other hand, in America, what are you going to do? There's every idiot around you's got a gun. Yeah. So you kind of need the bodyguards, and you need that, So there's levels, and I'm quite happy not to be going to that level,
Yeah.
I suppose it's also an America thing as well, because in Britain, I suspect it's a little bit easier. People behave in different ways. But yeah, I'm not that keen on that. I do enjoy talking to people though, and that's the other thing as well is like the level of recognition that we currently have. I only ever get people who like me
because they like you.
Yeah. Which I suspect changes over scale. You know what I mean? So having to deal with some dickhead coming up to me in the street when I'm going for a walk with my wife and son, like that's not really what I particularly am interested in.
Yeah. Although that said, like sometimes it can scale positively, isn't it? Like you've seen that. I mean, maybe you've seen the clip of Jordan Peterson talking about what it's like when, I'm sure he's talked about this lots of times, but what it's like to be him. It's like in every city and every street, someone comes up to me and starts telling me how like, you know, they've turned their life around, and you know they share some like intimate details with him because they've listened to him for so many hours and they feel like they can share it with him. And someone was like, "What's that like?" And he was like, "It's overwhelming. It's both like amazing and terrible all at the same time." It's got to be like he definitely suffers a different level of it.
Yeah, well, thankfully I haven't changed anyone's life, so I don't have that problem.
Well, keep that up.
I'm gonna keep that up. I'm just gonna do stupid dick jokes on the internet.
Are you going to see? I've got tickets tonight for Pearson.
Yeah, I won't be seeing the show, but we're doing stuff later in the week that I'll get to see him a couple of times.
Oh, okay. Yeah. You got him coming on the podcast.
No. We've had him on a couple of times, and we're not doing anything with him on his this trip, but I'll get to see him.
Oh, that's okay. That's cool.
Yeah.
Smart guy. I'm very excited.
Yeah.
Later on.
You'll have a great time though, I'm sure.
Yeah, because I've been encouraged to delve into the Bible by a friend of mine because we keep having arguments about religion. He's like, you can't have this, because it comes down to a point. He's like, you can't argue with me because you haven't read it. I'm like, fine, right, let me read it. So I'm like, yeah, in the early books.
So he's religious and you're not.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what I really truly believe. I think there's a God. Beyond that, I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah.
There's a lot of arguments that I like.
Have you worked out the sex of the God yet?
I'd say
or his gender identity.
Probably non-binary.
Non-binary.
Yeah.
Good answer. Yeah. Very inclusive.
Yes, exactly. Well, I mean, I wouldn't want to leave someone out, like 99.9% of people. That would be foolish.
Yep.
So, your book then, An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. Why, the West is a capitalist, patriarchal, former empire, colonial. Yeah, we're we're just the worst people in the world because no other country ever had an empire, obviously,
or slavery,
or sort of did any awful things in their past. So Britain and you can include America, we're uniquely awful. So why would you love the cultures that have emanated from not just these places, but the West is generally America centric. So why do you love these awful things?
Well, for precisely the reasons that you mocked with your ironic introduction there, which is that the idea that we are uniquely evil in any way is complete bullshit. We are the most progressive people in the history of the world. The West, for all its many flaws, and they're multiple, and I talk, as you know, about some of them in the book too. The West is the one civilization that ended slavery and forced others to end slavery when they were really not that keen to do so. And on every other measure, whether it's the treatment of women, the treatment of minorities, the treatment of immigrants, the treatment of different ethnic and religious groups, the West is head and shoulders above not only any historical period, but also any geographical area in the world. This is kind of what I wanted to explain to people: is we are unique in the world's history, and we're unique in the world today, in how progressive we are and all those things. And so to spend years, as we have done, beating ourselves up about how not quite sufficiently progressive we are seems to me to be very misguided. And it leads to what we just had Frank Furedi on Triggernometry. We haven't released it yet, but he calls it, I really like this term, he calls it moral disarmament. And I would add to that moral unilateral disarmament, where you go, well, we no longer have any belief that we're actually good people. We no longer believe that our values are good values, that our values matter, that the way we do things is actually worth sharing with others, that when a country in Eastern Europe, for example, seeks to be independent and democratic and move in a more westward direction, a lot of people don't understand that there's a moral argument to be involved in that situation and to support those people in their desire to be as free and as prosperous as we are, because everything is considered to be just simply an issue of money. Who are we to impose something on other people, especially when it's not in our own financial best interest? And this moral unilateral disarmament is a direct product of the self-loathing that the West has been encouraged to adopt by the very people who are now invading countries in Eastern Europe.
Yeah. Like, why do you think it is that we have this like really strange idea that like, oh, the French aren't racist, or the Austrians aren't racist, or the Italians aren't racist?
I can think of at least one Austrian who was pretty racist.
I can think of many. I know some.
Yeah.
Like, I lived there for the 5 winter seasons there. I know that, like, I love the people, love the country, but they're pretty racist sometimes. Like, this, it's just, I mean, and they laugh about it. They're aware of it. Like, what do you think it is that makes us feel that it is so bad here? Because this was one of the things that I discovered when I was writing my book, was that like Britain is like, in terms of attitudes to immigrants, like the most accepting in the whole of Europe and the whole world. I was blown away, and I was like, hang on, so we're the racists. Like, why is that like not, blatantly obvious?
Well, for precisely the reason that you gave, which is we are not racist, and it's only people who are not racist that will be asking these questions of themselves. People who are racist don't give a shit about being accused of being racist. If you say to Russians you're racist, they don't give a shit, right? It's only prosperous, comfortable Western people who have an ethnically diverse country because they have allowed lots of people to come here, right? If you look around London, almost none of the people who are here, who look different to a white British person, none of those people are here as a result of being brought here as slaves, right? So all of the people who live here are people who've come here as immigrants. They've been allowed to come. I'm not saying they were always treated the way that they should have been, but they wouldn't have been treated that well in any other country they would have gone to at that time either. So it's precisely because that we've made so much progress on these issues that we now are victims of our own success. And by the way, I always say this, human beings respond to incentives. And if you are a person who wants to have a media career, and a person who happens to come from a minority background, or it's not just a media career, it's a comedy career, it's a career in anything that's public facing or related to one of these institutions, it is much better for you to be a victim than someone who says, actually, I reject all of this. I reject the idea that Britain's... So, for example, my position in the comedy industry is essentially as someone who is hated and, suspect to a lot of people in the comedy industry, whereas someone who goes on stage every night and complains about how they're oppressed is worshipped and given opportunities and whatever. And I don't say that in any sort of like, oh, I didn't get the opportunities I deserve sort of way. I couldn't really care less at this point. It pushed me in the direction that I needed to be pushed to create my own thing and be successful with it. But that's the environment we operate in, where you are rewarded for complaining, and you are punished for being stoic and for actually going, no, if you want to make something of yourself, whatever your skin color, whatever your sex, whatever your sexuality, whatever your background, the best place to do that is in a Western Anglosphere country. That's the best place to succeed, to thrive, to get better, to raise your children, whatever. And it's that message that's unpopular because we incentivize victimhood.
Like, I don't know if you saw the clip of from Eddie Dempsey that was doing the rounds like last week or so, and he was basically making the accusation that the Labour Party and the left have made this calculation that if they focus on like these like race-based, identity-based politics, that they can capture like a certain portion of the working class plus like a portion of the middle class, and then like a group of non-white voters. and that they've just calculated that that's enough to get them into power. Like, do you think that it is a focused calculation on these kind of politics? And do you think that they actually think that's a good idea? Or is this just them sort of trying to appease, whatever politically correct ideals they think people have?
I give them less credit than that, if I'm honest with you, Josh. I don't think they sat down and went, this is what we need to do, because if they did do that, they never would have done it in the first place, because in terms of the percentages and in terms of how people actually vote, that makes absolutely zero sense. Because what you're talking about, it's an American idea. This comes from America, where it makes a little bit more sense because they have a much more diverse ethnically country, right? So in this country, I think black people are only about 3% of the population. We have a much larger in percentage terms Muslim population in this country than they do in America. But if you look at the statistics, that math doesn't work in the UK. If you abandon the working class in favor of university graduates and ethnic minorities, you're not going to have an electoral coalition that's big enough, which is why I say if they'd actually sat down and thought it through, they'd never do it. They're doing it for ideological reasons. They believe that it is the morally correct thing to do, to privilege people who are quote-unquote previously oppressed, and they also fear and despise and resent the working class for their backward opinions, for their inability to get with the program, for the fact that they don't want uncontrolled, unlimited immigration into Britain, and so on and so forth. These are problems for them, moral problems. They're not factual or whatever. It's a moral issue to them, the fact that these people, and I'm sure you've read Jonathan Haidt's work. This is one of the things he talks about. The thing that is simultaneously the left's greatest strength and greatest weakness is its obsession with emotion and morality, which makes them willing to look after people who need looking after in situations where the right might not want to do it. But the downside of that is they are more interested in ideology often than they are in pragmatic solutions. The right has its own version of this, of course, too. But on the left, I just think it's ideological for them. They know what the morally correct thing to do is, and that is to look after the oppressed, who they've designated oppressed, and other middle-class university graduates like them who all think the right thing and have the right opinions.
Like there's been, and I've listened to quite a lot of people talking about the sort of the reasons for the growth of this, sort of very left-wing neo-Marxist ideology, especially amongst universities, then through political parties. You can argue a lot of the sort of more cultural side of it has gone through both parties, and just like most of the elite, however you want to define that. But I've heard a lot of people with very different opinions on why this has been pushed, essentially, or why it's become successful and so widespread, or at least seemingly. And the argument that was most shocking, but also almost most seemed to make the most sense to me, was the one, I think it was made by Matt Walsh, where he says that they are attempting to sever the next generation from their parents ideologically, so that they live in such a different world that they will reject the world of their parents entirely, and that they can then build their own new sort of, like, I don't know, proto-communist downtown Portland kind of state. Do you think that's an insane proposition? Like, what's your...
I don't think it's an insane proposition, but I don't think it's accurate. I think if you want the next generation to separate themselves from the parents' world, you just need to let them grow up, and they're going to do it anyway. I mean, that's what children always do, right? I think they're much... first of all, it's never going to be one argument. I think it's a conflagration of different things. We interviewed a woman called Mary Eberstad, who wrote a book called Primal Screams, How the Sexual Revolution Gave Us Identity Politics. And her argument is that the technological creations of the sexual revolution, which is essentially the pill, allowed modes of behavior that previously would have been impossible, and it separated sex from commitment. And so this has advantaged men, some men, and disadvantaged women and particularly children, because it's led to the breakdown of the family. And we've seen an explosion in single parenthood. And I always have to say this because people are, they're unwilling to hear the intention behind what I'm saying. I'm not blaming single parents. Like my wife and I just had a baby 4 months ago. I cannot imagine raising that child by myself, or my wife, who's a brilliant mum, raising that child by herself. It is hard. So I'm not suggesting that those people aren't doing their best and aren't doing a good job, but the facts are very clear. The children who grow up in a single parent environment do way worse at school. They're far more likely to end up in prison. They're far more likely to end up in drug abuse. They're far more likely to become alcoholics. On almost every measure of social well-being, they score far lower than children who had two parents, on average. On average. So the breakdown of the family leads to a lot of unhappy people. Right, and unhappy people are not the sort of people who are likely to want to support the status quo, because they're unhappy. And particularly if you're unhappy in the modern world, you've got the tools to project your unhappiness onto the world much more than you would have done in the past, because there's other people who are unhappy who are all telling you the same thing, which is it's not your fault. The fact that you're unhappy is not because you haven't worked hard enough. It's not because you haven't tried to improve your life circumstances. It's not because you haven't done enough of personal development or therapy or whatever it is to improve your mindset to succeed. It's not because of the choices that you've made. It's not because the financial decisions you've made are the consequences of your actions and what you haven't learned yet and whatever. No, it's the fault of the system. It's the patriarchy. It's the this, it's the that, it's the whatever. And so you've got a group of people who are looking out into the world, and they are seeking an explanation for why they feel miserable, right? And they are finding other people who have that same eternal feeling. I mean, you talk about Portland and Antifa and whatever. Look at the mugshots. Andy No post mugshots of Antifa members who are getting arrested for rioting, whatever. Look at their faces. Are those the faces of happy people who are living in a stable environment with a family and a couple of kids? No, these are not happy people. And so the sexual revolution is part of that. Then you add on top of that, in this country, the housing crisis, the fact that young people really struggle to pair up and find somewhere to live. And as you know, I talk about this in the book quite a lot. It's really important. If you want people to be grounded, and I've experienced this in the last few months, there's nothing that makes you collide with reality more than having a child. Because whatever bullshit ideas you had in your head about what's true and what's not, men and women, there's no difference. Really?
Yeah.
Right. Look at a baby, look at a female baby, look at a male baby. The difference is pretty clear, right? And then it's yeah. And all sorts of other things like that. Whereas if we all live on the internet, on our phones, in a flat share somewhere in the outskirts of London, and we don't actually interact with real things in the real world. We're just on our social devices. Well, on the internet, the idea that there's no difference between men and women makes perfect sense, right? Because equality, man. Well, why wouldn't you want equality? It's only when you're confronted with reality that you suddenly start to realize that this is happening. This is one of the interesting things that's changing in the landscape. We had Louise Perry on the show. And this is very much her argument, that we've come to a position where this endless pursuit of sexual liberation, sexual freedom, and whatever has allowed people to become divorced from the reality of things. And we are now starting to see the costs of those ideological obsessions be borne by the very people who've been forced to imbibe them. And you're going to see, I don't know how old you are, but I'm 39. For our generation, there is a large cohort of women who've come to a point, if they're, say, my age, and they haven't made certain decisions that they would have needed to have made to have the things that they want to have, that are starting to realize, actually, this really wasn't all that it was made out to be.
Yeah, live your best life isn't always the best advice.
Yeah.
I'm 28. I know I look kind of old. It's the ski seasons.
You're Irish, mate. You guys are all like that.
Yeah, well, that's also true. Long, hardened life of being oppressed by the British.
Yes.
I have that discussion frequently with really good friends of mine. I'm like, I don't feel oppressed. And they're like, well, you're Protestant.
Well, see,
Like, yeah, but just like, you know, I actually like I just like I mean, you know, you could make the case, right, that because of I don't know, there were some slights that I had in my childhood because of you know, growing up in Northern Ireland. It's just like, really? I mean, I don't think so. Like I got to go to a pretty good school. Like Northern Ireland's got the best education system in the UK. I'm pretty pleased about that. Got smaller class sizes on average. Went to a grammar school. That was great.
Well, see, there's a difference between being disadvantaged and being oppressed. I have no doubt that your generation would have obviously grown up with stories from your family and your parents of all the difficult things that happened in Ireland, and partly due to British rule, no doubt, right? But the question of whether you were oppressed and whether you're disadvantaged are completely separate. There are many ways in which I've been disadvantaged in my life. There are many ways in which I've been privileged in my life, but it's oppression it takes two to tango. You have to want to describe yourself in that way. I have this argument with a friend of mine who is, believe it or not, even shorter than me. He's like 5'4" or something like that. And he's very much on board with all of this stuff, oppression and people being disadvantaged. And I said to him, well, what about you? You're 5'4". We know, statistically speaking, heightism is a massive thing in society, particularly for men. We know that like 93% of top CEOs in this country are all over 6 foot. We know blah, blah, all sorts of statistics about it. And he went, yeah, but you know, being short made me who I am. I had to deal with this and I had to deal with that. And so at an individual level, people understand that even the difficulties you experience will sometimes be the forces that shape you into being the person who is successful in some way. So oppression requires you to want to be oppressed.
Yeah, and I just don't like that attitude.
Well, exactly.
You start, you know, then you're starting with like, oh, well, my feet are tied together, so I can't run, you know, whilst the knots aren't actually tied. It's a strange position to be in sometimes. I mean, we have some great discussions with them about it, but they've never managed to convince me that I've been oppressed. So, like you said something that like a little while ago there, it was about it's not your fault. It's not your fault that you've had these problems. It's not your fault that, you know, your life's not exactly what you want it to be. It's like you're perfect the way you are. Like just accept who you are and be that person, and everything will be okay. There'll be sunshine and rainbows, and all the doors in the world will open to you.
Hashtag body positivity.
Hashtag body positivity. Exactly. Yeah. And you see, until I'd listened to a few Jordan Peterson lectures, I don't know how many years ago this was, 4 or 5 years ago, I had never heard someone speak the words, there's like, you could be better. I had never heard that. Like,
wow.
I'd never heard, it wasn't that like people hadn't told me, so you could do great things, right? But no one had said, yeah, and you're the person who has to, like, you know, get your shit together and do the things that you're capable of. And it strikes me that like the amount of people who just believe you're like, oh, just love yourself, that makes them turn to this. Well, you know, it's not my fault then. What do you think makes that so pervasive in like society these days?
It's a brilliant excuse. It's a brilliant excuse for not doing anything.
That excuse could have been there for centuries,
and it has been.
But like, I don't feel like it's been used.
Well, we had a different culture only a few decades ago. The culture was you get on with it, right? And that stoicism that people were encouraged had its trade-offs, negative trade-offs too, where people who were, you know, who actually needed help were just not given the help and told, you know, oh, you can't read. Well, it's because you're stupid. It's not because you've got dyslexia or whatever, right? So in some ways, this culture shift has been positive to some extent, but it's all about overreach, and the pendulum has always swung quite a lot. To be honest with you, I don't think that I ever really heard that said to me either until I got in my 20s. I got into personal development a lot, and there I can't remember who said it to me, but it was someone said, why be yourself when you could be someone actually worthwhile, you know? And I've always found that a really important message. You know, being yourself doesn't mean that you don't need to improve. Being yourself means being more authentic, but being more authentic requires you to improve all the time, because the inauthenticity that we all struggle with sometimes is a product of the fact that we haven't let go of the desire to impress other people or to look a certain way or to behave a certain way for other people, not for us. So I think it's always been an issue for people, and that's why figures like Jordan and others are really important, because young people need to be told all the time, like, it's not about you not being good enough. But in what other area would you think that like, who looks at a 17-year-old footballer and goes, yeah, you don't need to learn anything.
Yeah. You're perfect.
You're perfect. Just don't work on your game. Don't try and be better. Don't exercise more. Don't try to look after your diet. Don't do yoga so you extend your career. Don't study film so you get better. Don't work on your weaknesses. Don't do weights. Who says that? No one does, right? We all know.
It sounds so absurd when you put it like that, man.
But that's the society we live in. So the way I always thought about it, and that's why I've always been interested in personal development. I'm less interested in therapy because it's not really the way that I frame these things for me. I'm interested in performance. I'm interested in creating things. I'm interested in building things. I'm interested in improving my own skill set in order to do more of the things that I want to do out there in the world. And in order to do that, well, obviously I need to be better. Otherwise, I wouldn't be where I am, right? Like, we are all exactly where we are based on the things that we are doing and not doing. Now, that's a mindset. That's not the truth.
Yeah.
That's a mindset, right? Because the truth is, of course you are where you are due to the circumstances of your life. You were born in a certain place and you got a certain education and you met or didn't meet certain people and you had certain parents or didn't, and blah, 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 blah. Your life is not purely under your control. But guess what? You can only control the part of it that you control. And the only way your life is going to change in a significant way, and you're going to feel in control of your life, is if you take charge of that and you work on it for yourself. That's why, I've always not only sought to improve for myself, but in terms of Triggernometry now, we have me, Francis, and our executive producer, Anton, who are like the core team who started it, really. And then we have a bunch of other people that work with us. And I'm always from a position of, being forced essentially into a position of leadership in that way. I'm always not only thinking about how do I improve, I'm always thinking about how do I support this person in opening up more and being more of themselves and thriving and succeeding. And there will come a point where, part of the journey for somebody who's working with us will be for them actually to step up by leaving Triggernometry. And I'd like to hope that in that situation, I would be there for them to support them in doing that. Because to me, that's the most important thing in any human being's life, is that growth and that progress and that development. And I wouldn't want to stand in someone's way if the next step for them was to move away from being part of my team,
Who do you look at for like inspiration or ways to try and improve yourself at this point, or in terms of maybe even like management, like trying to be that leader? Like
Dana White.
Dana White?
Yeah. I like that guy because I think he's built something gigantic from nothing, literally nothing. Yeah. I like him because of his attitude. He just literally doesn't give a shit. I think that he also he has a hard-nosed business side to him, but there's also a compassionate side to him as well, from the way I've seen that he treats his staff and the types of people that he employs, and a bunch of behind-the-scenes stuff. I've never met him, but from what I gather. So he combines being a ruthless businessman with actually looking after people, and also particularly during the pandemic, I saw that a lot of people wanted to roll over and die in a corner, and he wasn't having any of it. And that was the attitude that we tried to have at Triggernometry as well. So from a business point of view, that's kind of how I look at. And I've also, I'm getting to that age and that point where it's going to sound a bit weird and maybe a bit arrogant, but I don't really have heroes anymore. I used to. And now I'm starting to meet some of them. And I kind of go, they're just human beings, just like me. And they're human beings who worked hard and were creative and whatever. And if I'm working hard and I'm creative, then I'll do the thing that I'm supposed to do, but for me, it was always more about, looking around. And this is what people sometimes don't understand. people look around and they go, okay, Joe Rogan does his podcast like this, and this guy does this thing like that. If I want to be a podcaster, I got to do what Joe Rogan does. And if I want to create a combat sports franchise, I got to do what Dana White does or whatever. It's not how the world works. No one wants to watch the second best Joe Rogan in the world.
Already.
Right? You got to look at other people and take small bits from them and integrate that into who you are. That's so it's going to sound somewhat contradictory to what we've just been talking about, but the most important thing, and I think the most powerful thing in life, is to be authentic to who you are. That does not mean that you don't work on your game. These are separate things. So with Triggernometry, for example, when we started, we looked around at a bunch of people, and the bunch was much smaller back then, when we started 4.5 years ago. But it was like, Joe Rogan has great conversations, right? Do I think that we could do a 3-hour unstructured discussion about anything? Is that what I think people are interested in? I don't think so. For me, I really love Joe and I respect the shit out of what he's done, but I didn't think that was me.
Yeah.
I'm not the sort of person, like, if you sit down with me, we're probably not going to have an unstructured conversation for 3 hours. Like, I've got things I'm interested in, and I've got a lot of things I couldn't care less about. Joe is way more curious and open-minded like that than I am.
He's been down a lot of rabbit holes in his time.
Yeah. But when you meet him, you just go, that's his personality. This is a dude that's just, like, interested in everything. I'm not like that. So for me to pretend to be like that and to sit and listen to someone talk, an MMA fighter talking about aliens for an hour, like, I'd struggle with that.
I'm right there. I'm all with it when they start talking.
When
it goes off the cliff, I'm like, yes, bring.
And I pass no judgment on it. I'm just saying that's not me, right? So, and then you look at Joe and you go, what he's done is, the reason he's so successful is he's incredibly authentic, right? And that's definitely something that I've always thought from day one, like, that's something we got to work on. Because when you start doing it, you can't just pick up a camera and just suddenly be yourself. Like, there's almost nobody in the world who's like that. It's a skill. You work on it, right? But I also looked at Joe's show, and I didn't think that we wanted to replicate that look. We didn't want to have the microphones in front of your face and the headphones, even though that produces better quality sound. I thought it was much better to have a conversation. There's nothing in between the people who are sitting down, and it's more of a chat in that way. There was a bunch of people.
It's interesting. I hadn't clocked that was a thing.
Yeah. So I've thought very carefully about that from day one, and Francis and I were always talking about it. So you got to take things from different people as inspiration and build your own thing. Otherwise, you're just going to be an imitation of somebody else, and no one wants to see an imitation.
Yeah. I mean, it's something I'm discovering. Like, obviously, as many podcasters were, the thing that made me want to have the podcast was I watched like an episode of Rogan. It was like, holy shit, people have these conversations. Like, these exist. It's like, how do I do this? But now I'm starting to see like how I can make it more, me essentially, which is really cool for me.
Well, you don't need to make it more you just got to be more you, and then it's going to happen by itself.
Yeah, I mean, I have an idea of how to make it like fit my personality, I think, at least anyway. Awesome. But that requires I need to get the studio first. I'm still looking for the room. But yeah, so last question then, because you've been very generous with your time. What advice would you give as an interviewer? Like, what would be like a tip or just something that you've learned that you would give as a piece of advice for someone who, does a lot of
it's kind of comes back to what we've just been talking about, which is just ask the questions that you find interesting and don't ever not ask a question that you want to answer to. That's been the journey for me, is kind of going, I have this question, is it wrong, is it offensive, is it this, is it that? And then when you just take that filter off, life gets a lot easier. And then you find out a lot of the people who are watching your show really wanted to hear the answer to that question.
Is there a question that you regret not asking?
No, I don't really. There should be loads of them. But first of all, I've got a terrible memory, so I don't remember. And also, maybe for that reason, I don't really believe in regret. I don't. I think regret is just it's kind of like negative masturbation. It's like you're going over something for no benefit. It's kind of the opposite. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Regret. The only useful purpose of the past is to teach you lessons about the future, right? So once you've taken the lesson out of something, well, what are you gonna? You can't change the past, so why would you regret it? The past is what made you who you are. You got to take the lessons and move on. I don't really believe in regret.
That's a fantastic line on which to end. So, man, thanks very much. It's been, an absolute pleasure. Great
I really
chat.
appreciate it. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Great chatting with you. Thanks, mate.
Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the podcast. If you want to leave us a comment, that would be awesome. Please like, share, subscribe, and if you're listening on Apple, please leave us a review. Until next time, thanks for listening.